Religious Freedom Project, of which I am fortunate enough to be a director. I should introduce myself. I'm Tom Farr, director of the Religious Freedom Project here at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace and World Affairs at Georgetown University. Our goal is to build knowledge about religious freedom and to provide reasons, if you like, why people should at least move toward religious freedom. We define it in a very, very broad sense, and that is, in an ideal sense, I would suggest nowhere in the world does this ideal sense of religious freedom, this definition exist, but let me tell you what it is. We believe it's the right to believe or not, the right to worship or not, but if one has religious belief, to enter into the public life of one's nation, society, culture, on the basis of those beliefs, in civil society, in business, in politics. We got more controversial as we went through that. It's very easy to say. What all that means, of course, is one of the subjects of our conference today. Our first panel is going to look at the question. We like to put questions and have scholars who are experts in various fields that cut across these questions, talk about them from the context of their own expertise and their work. And we have a terrific panel to engage the following question. Does religious freedom undermine terrorism and conflict? And does it foster secure societies? Well, this is a version of something that we touched upon yesterday. In fact, we touch upon it often in the Religious Freedom Project, because if it is the case that religious freedom can undermine terrorism, then obviously it is something that everyone in this room would embrace, and indeed I would argue throughout the world. So one of the things that we investigate at the Religious Freedom Project, along with other colleagues, is how can we talk about this? I mean, it's very difficult to prove, but nevertheless, I would think all of us would agree, very, very important. Let me read very briefly the questions we put to our panelists. Does a lack of religious freedom foster certain kinds of violent religious extremism, terrorism, and conflict? And if so, what kinds of religious restrictions appear to be most strongly correlated? And how do you explain that? How do you talk about that? What's the logic of that? Second, does the presence of religious freedom, the first was about the absence, does the presence of religious freedom, robust religious freedom, hinder terrorism and other forms of religion-related violent conflict, extremism? And does it foster, as I say, security and stability? And again, if so, what's the logic of that? I mean, you know, we can all make assertions, and I don't mind doing that from time to time myself, but you don't convince people with mere assertions, particularly the skeptics. So we want to investigate a little bit the logic. And finally, are there contexts or regions especially important for American national security? As many of you know, the United States has, as an official part of its foreign policy, the advancement of religious freedom. And it has had this as a legal requirement. That is to say, Congress passed a law 15 years ago, 1998. So, you know, one dimension of what we're talking about today is how have, if at all, we dealt with that in our foreign policy, and we have two panelists in particular. All of our panelists have something to say about this, but two have been over in that ugly building at C Street called Foggy Bottom. Actually, if you like square buildings, it's really quite attractive. All right. So let me introduce our panelists, and let's get started. We're going to ask them each to give us a brief rundown of their own take on each of those questions that I just gave you. The first is Brian Grimm. Brian Grimm is a senior researcher in religion and world affairs and director of cross-national data at the Pew Research Center's Religion and Public Life Project. He is the author of a terrific book. If you care anything about this issue, get this book. It's called, we got some great titles here in this crowd, The Price of Freedom Denied. The Price of Freedom Denied, precisely what we're going to be talking about today, with his co-author, Roger Finke. Brian will be presenting some data from the Pew Research Center, where his work, and I think Cole would agree with this and everybody in this field, it's almost true to say that his work has revolutionized the way that we talk about this issue. And for that, I'm very, very grateful to Brian. Now, I want to say one other thing about him, a little, to explain something. I call Brian, he doesn't know this, it's the first time he's heard it, a dragnet scholar. Now, only those of you of a certain age have ever heard of Dragnet, namely the old geezers in the crowd here. Jack Webb played a Los Angeles detective, and whenever he was interviewing somebody, the person would begin to give their own opinion, and he would say, "Just the facts, ma'am." Brian works in the facts, and therefore, because of his position, he doesn't offer his opinion. I know privately his opinion is quite valuable, and again, that's another reason to get his book. But today, because of his position, it's going to be just the facts, ma'am. He's going to tell us some very important statistical work that he's done, which will set the stage for our talk. Second, John Owen is the Ambassador Henry J. and Mrs. Marion R. Taylor Professor at Politics at the University of Virginia. Wow, that's a...
That's as long as my talk, actually.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That's all you're allocated, that amount of time. He is the author of many books. And I'm not going to go through this except to say that I am delighted to tell you, you're going to see in a minute why I'm so delighted, that John Owen, who is a real expert in his field, will be joining our project next year as one of our senior scholars in the Religious Freedom Project. And John, we are just delighted to have you today. He's going to give us a little bit of a historical approach to the issues that we're talking about, which will be a perfect setup for and I mean that in the best possible way, for our next panelist, Tamara Wittes, who is a senior fellow and director of the Sabin Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. Tamara served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. If you know anything about the State Department, you know that these are the people who really do the work and set the policy at the State Department. Deputy Secretaries of State are very important. Near Eastern Affairs. Talk about the lion's den. Near Eastern Affairs at the State Department from late 2009 to early 2012. She coordinated U.S. policy on democracy and human rights in the Middle East. Now, some of you who know me know that I have been something of a critic of the State Department. But people like Tamara Wittes, whom I was fortunate enough to meet when she was a Deputy Assistant Secretary, I wish we had more of people like her in the State Department, because I believe she really gets it, and you're going to see why in just a few minutes. Not that she's going to say things necessarily that I agree with. We've been on panels before. But she gets it, and the way that she approaches these issues, I think, is terrifically sophisticated. And I'll say this in preference, as a prefatory to speaking about Will Inboden. It just happens that the ambassador, the current ambassador at large, I don't know if you know this, is leaving under the Obama administration. Ambassador at large for international religious freedom. She's been there for 2.5 years. She's moving back into private life. And it'll be very interesting to see whether Secretary Kerry chooses somebody for the new ambassador at large who, if you like, gets it. What we're talking about today. And I'm not going to name any names, but I think there are at least 3 or 4 panelists that ought to be candidates for that position. We'll see if they are. Will Inboden, associate. Now, whether they would accept the nomination if nominated is another question. Associate professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs and executive director of the Clements Center for History, Strategy, and Statecraft at the University of Texas, Austin. Will has a very distinguished bio, but like the others, I'm not going to go through it except to say that we have had Will Inboden as one of our scholars for the last 3 years. We're delighted at the work that he has done. He is the author of a book that I've used in my classes since it came out, Religion in American Foreign Policy, 1945-1960, subtitled The Soul of Containment. What a great title. He is also authoring for the Religious Freedom Project, if I can use your tentative title, Threatening Faith, Religious Freedom and American National Security, precisely what we're going to be talking about today. All right, so you see the lineup, you see the expertise we have. We'll begin with Brian. Take it away, Brian.
Okay, well, thanks. I don't really have a rebuttal about being Sergeant Joe Friday. I think that's a compliment. But to give...
You also reveal yourself as a geezer.
Yeah, I know. I am a grandfather, so I maybe don't look like it. But
you're kidding.
Yeah, I'm going to see my 2 grandkids in Italy leaving tomorrow. So.
Amazing. I told you this is like the Letterman show, so... Brian, please.
At the Pew Research Center, we look at the world and how it's changing and try to present information in a way that is helpful to policymakers, academics, scholars, and the general public to help them understand the world today and how it's changing. And I'll just give one anecdote of why that's useful and not just giving my opinion on these things. I was speaking at Warwick University in England about dynamics and religious change and religion, and one of the questions that I was presenting was different views in different countries about whether or not you needed to believe in God to be a moral person. And high percentages of populations in Africa share this belief. A high percentage of people in America share that belief, but in Europe, it's relatively lower percentages. And as I was talking about this, the audience, which were several hundred people, university professors, students, somebody from the crowd said, "But what do you believe?" And I just thought, well, actually what I believe is really not so important. I want you to understand how the world is. That's what's important to understand, not necessarily my take on the world. So ever since that experience, I've had a sort of freedom in not having to give my point of view because, I'm not trying to influence you to think a certain way. Or I just want to give you information that then you can form your opinions and think about the data and come to conclusions and maybe have better ideas than my own opinion could ever come up with. So I've been studying religious freedom, but from a particular point of view. It's very difficult to measure religious freedom. So instead, I look at the inverse of religious freedom, and that's restrictions on religion coming from both governments and from individuals or groups in society. And so as I measure these things, I look at concrete measures. So for government restrictions, it's whether or not the government limits preaching, proselytizing, conversion, whether or not the government uses force against people in society who have faith, whether or not they limit what religious groups can operate, and also whether or not they create a level playing field or tilt it so that one group has all the advantage and all the rest of the groups are climbing uphill trying to gain some advantage within the country. Then I look at social hostilities involving religion, and these are, again, concrete things that we look at the Pew Research Center. Religion-related terrorism, mob violence involving religion, sectarian violence, hate crimes, attempts to enforce religious norms through violence or coercion. So these are the types of things that I look at, and we count these up in every country of the world, looking at a variety of major reports and add them up into indexes so that we can compare the condition in countries around the world, as well as look at these indicators and track them over time. The one major finding from our study is that about 3/4 of the world's population live in countries with high restrictions on religion, coming either from governments or groups and societies. And these trends, over the 6 years of our study, have become more and more restrictive. We see it coming from governments, but we also see it emanating from groups and societies. So the terrorism that we saw in Kenya just a few weeks ago was not an isolated event. There have been attacks by al-Shabaab throughout Kenya over the past several years. And if you look at a chart I have on our website, you can see religious hostilities in Kenya just rising year after year until it's reached a level today, which is the highest it's been in many years in Kenya. So the things that we've been seeing increase are things such as harassment of religious minorities, violence towards religious minorities. We see increases in the attempts to enforce religious norms on groups in society. For instance, in India, there are Hindu nationalist groups that are now having morality codes based on their interpretation of Hinduism that prevent intermingling between religious groups. And when groups come together, such as Muslims and Hindus, they'll intervene with violence to try to split them up. We also see increases in sectarian violence, mob violence, and religion-related terrorism. It's been growing in past years, not decreasing. So we see more than a third of countries worldwide having religion-related terrorist activities within them, and about 1 out of 5 countries have had religion-related terrorist attacks just in the past year. So looking at these different measures that I have, I can also see the patterns and observe the patterns and the circumstances in which these types of violence occur. And what we find in the data is that where you have higher levels of government restrictions on religion, you tend to have higher levels of social hostilities involving religion, including the questions you asked, Tom, about extremism, terrorism, and those types of activities. So where governments try to restrict religion very severely, you see higher levels of social hostilities involving religion. But the inverse is also true. So where you have, in particular, sectarian violence, that's the biggest predictor of having high government restrictions on religion. Now, of the different kinds of government restrictions on religion that we look at, there's one that stands out as having the strongest relationship with social hostilities involving religion, including extremist types of violence, and that's when a government favors one religion above the rest. We did an analysis in our last report that came out in June, looking at the situation in Arab Spring and the changes that happened during that time, a time when many people had hoped that you'd see a new dawn of spring or a new dawn of freedom. What we found is that government restrictions continued to tighten, but then religious violence swelled during that time. And the one government restriction in the Middle East and North Africa that is higher than anywhere else in the world, in fact, it has 8 times the level of restriction, so to speak, compared to with other world regions, is government favoritism of one religion above others. So when the government is biased toward one religion or favors one to the exclusion of others. So that level is 8 times higher in the Middle East and North Africa. So therefore, it's not surprising from the data that this is a region beset by religious hostilities and violence. And then I'll conclude with the one type of social hostility that is most closely connected with government restrictions that I've already mentioned, sectarian violence. And again, in the Middle East and North Africa, that has the highest level of sectarian violence as a region of any other region of the world. And therefore, it's not surprising that government restrictions are high. And then the book that Tom mentioned, The Price of Freedom Denied, I go beyond what we do at Pew Research to try to statistically control for other possible explanations of why these types of violence may be occurring. And you can get that book and see that. But what we find is this interplay between government restrictions and social hostilities, where one is high, the other tends to be high, and then that tends to set up a cycle of violence. And therefore, it's a very difficult cycle to disentangle, because when as hostilities increase, the natural tendency of governments is to try to counter that with higher restrictions. And when religions feel that they're being restricted, sometimes their tendency is to respond with force as well.
And of course, one of the many policy issues that comes out of Brian's presentation on that last point is how do you break that cycle of social hostilities resulting in more government restriction, resulting in more social hostilities? Very difficult question, obviously, for the country involved, and even more so if the United States decides it wants to make a contribution in some positive sense to breaking the cycle. I mean, that is a tough question, whether and if so, how. Okay, John Owen, over to you.
Good, thank you, Tom. I will have, as it turns out, a fair bit to say about how to break this cycle or how difficult it is historically. Thanks for having me on the panel. I am a political scientist, but these days I'm playing a historian. But I'm the kind of historian who drives real historians crazy because I range widely over history, and I'm not a close expert on any time or place, but I cover 500 years, and my colleagues in the history department of Virginia laugh and say, you don't know enough about this. And I say, yeah, but you don't know anything about this other thing that I know about. Anyway, I also cannot be as rigorous with my evidence as Brian Grimm and his folks at the Pew Institute are. We have to be careful when we draw on history, but I'm going to do that. I'm going to try to draw some lessons from especially European history over the last several hundred years about religious freedom and its lack. Tom mentioned the questions that were put to us. In general, does a lack of religious freedom foster violence, extremism, etc.? I'm going to take freedom or its lack to refer to official state policy, state law, rather than private intolerance, although I'll have something to say about private groups and intolerance as well. And I'm going to focus on the other hand, on private or non-state extremism, terrorism. I want to start by drawing a quick analogy with political freedom or ideological freedom, you might call it, rather than religious freedom. There is overlap. In the end, they may be the same thing, but I will talk about specifically political. And just call your attention back to the late 19th, early 20th century in Europe. The international left arose in the mid-19th century in Europe in the form, roughly speaking, of socialism and anarchism, two separate movements that sometimes cooperated. The first international emerged in 1864, Karl Marx. The second international, 1889. Power holders in European society never liked the left, but they differed on how to handle the rise of the left, of socialism and anarchism. There was a range of responses across countries. In Britain, roughly speaking, relative toleration. Fabian socialism took hold there. The Labour Party formed in the end of the 19th century, is now one of the two major parties in Britain. In Germany, Germany is took a middle path, toleration but some mild persecution. Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, had an anti-socialist campaign. The Social Democratic Party, SPD, formed, is still one of the major parties in Germany. The SPD grew very large by the turn of the 20th century. Third case is Russia, which harshly suppressed the left. This led to terrorism and radicalism in the form of Bolshevism and other leftist movements, a failed revolution in 1905, and of course the successful 1917 Bolshevik revolution. In Germany, after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, in Germany, the end of World War I, Bolshevik-like far leftists tried a revolution. It failed because the SPD, the kind of center left, didn't like them and actually suppressed them quite ruthlessly. So you have the conclusion, and I raise this because this is often raised by people who know a bit of history. The obvious answer here is do like Britain, tolerate minority ideologies, and things will come out better. And there's a lot to be said for that. But I think it's too simple, especially when we look at religious freedom going back a little further in European history. I'm going to focus on the Reformation, Counter-Reformation period for just a few minutes, and because the record here appears more complicated. First of all, just on what does religious repression, if you go back to the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe, produce in terms of radicalism and political violence and so on. In Southern Europe, it actually produced peace, perhaps not the sort of peace we would think is a just peace, but Catholic rulers in Spain, Portugal, Italy, Austria, Bavaria, and other places would not tolerate Protestant teaching or practice, and there was little private violence and reaction. There was some, but nothing like you saw elsewhere. Elsewhere, though, The same kind of repression produced, the Inquisition and so on, produced violence. In particular in the Netherlands, the same kings who ruled Spain ruled the Netherlands, tried to suppress a growing Calvinist movement in the Netherlands in the 1560s. Suppression backfired. The Dutch revolt began in 1567, years of war. The result was the independent Calvinist Dutch Republic. Now, what differed between these two types of case? Repression in Southern Europe leading to relative peace, and in Northern Europe not. Well, this is a complicated question. Protestantism never gained much of a foothold in what I'm calling the peaceful Southern cases, and it's very difficult to disentangle the causality. What was going on here? One argument that's been made is the secular nobility in Southern Europe were more content with their lot vis-a-vis the church and vis-a-vis princes than were the nobility in Northern and Northwestern Europe. This situation might be in a limited way analogous to that in Saudi Arabia today. There's enough contentment owing to oil revenues and so on that the entire social system, including Wahhabi Islam, is not challenged much. There is violence in Saudi Arabia, but it comes from jihadis. These aren't people who want more religious freedom, they want less. So already we see a mixed record. Religious toleration in early modern Europe. What about that? Areas that didn't practice, that actually opened things up. Here again we see some variation. In the Holy Roman Empire, roughly what is modern Germany, we see civil peace for many decades. After 1555, what was called the Religious Peace of Augsburg, where the Catholic and Lutheran leaders got together and hammered out a peace and tolerated one another's religion. Many decades of relative peace. In France, however, a very different outcome. In 1562, the Crown issued the Edict of Saint-Germain, which proclaimed limited toleration for Calvinist Huguenots. There was actually a backlash in France. The Guise family, one of the leading noble families, very devout, militant Catholic, carried out a massacre of Huguenots at worship in the commune of Oissy, and this led to the first of the French Wars of Religion. So what differed between these two cases? Again, you have variation in the outcome. Again, complicated. One answer is what we call the balance of power. That is to say, in Germany, in the Holy Roman Empire, where you had decades of peace, there was a rough balance between Lutheran and Catholic principalities and princes. They had fought a couple of wars recently. They'd figured out neither of us can really beat the other very easily. So that's one possibility. Whereas in France, the Huguenots probably composed only about 10% of the population. Now, they had a larger percentage of the nobility, the actual people with arms and horses and so on, but still an imbalance of power. Maybe that's the reason why. It may also have had to do with just exhaustion. Those wars that were fought in the Holy Roman Empire were quite bad, and subsequent wars looked like they might be worse. In fact, in 1618, they were worse, decades later. Whereas in France, I'm deliberately cherry-picking evidence here, actually. I'm picking France out before there were any wars of religion. Maybe the French hadn't learned just how destructive religious wars could be. Another question, does religious freedom hinder terrorism specifically? Now, terrorism, again, I'm assuming it refers to private, non-state violence against civilians. The public-private distinction 500 years ago in Europe is very blurry. But we can designate as private actors nobles who enjoyed power and privilege but were not sovereign, such as this House of Guise in France. Terrorism would be any violence by them against civilians. Now, I'll just refer back to what I talked about a moment ago. There was, in 1562 and a number of other periods, there were massacres, what we might call terrorism against unarmed civilians. But by the same token, there were cases where religious toleration seemed to dampen this. Are there contexts important for American national security today that illustrate some of these linkages? Well, just quickly let me run through some of these. Insofar as exhaustion from violence leads to less violence, some countries and regions today, unfortunately, might be in for more religious violence because years of state-enforced toleration, and I'm thinking here of Syria, Egypt, Iraq, have meant that some believe that religious minorities are illegitimate. That is to say, to pick out Christians in Syria might be regarded by Sunni Islamists as complicit with the Assad regime, therefore bad part of the problem. Some of these Islamists do not appear exhausted from war. They appear to have a lot of violence left in them, some of the radicals. Insofar as a balance of power among religious groups might lead to peace and less violence. Unfortunately, the future of religious minorities, the short-term future, it might look grim. In places like Lebanon, where there may be more of a balance, things actually might be better. In a place like Iraq, Shia Arabs compose the majority, but Sunni Arabs retain coherence and the ability to defend themselves, so there might be a rough balance there. And there we expect to see in the long term a reduction of religious violence. Let me mention in closing just one more condition that differs between early modern Europe and certainly industrial states today. The question is, where do some other less developed states fall in this? And that is, in early modern Europe, the state didn't have the ability to enforce its writ over all of the territory it claimed. Typically, say, the King of France did not rule all of France in the way that we might think of it. The nobles retained a lot of coercive power. They were the king's vassals, but they retained the ability to do lots of things he didn't necessarily like. So when the monarch declared religious toleration, he couldn't necessarily enforce it. There's a lesson in there probably for U.S. foreign policy today. A state that declares religious toleration might actually in the short term increase private religious violence if it's not able to enforce that writ, because it might be generating outrage among more intolerant elements who have the ability to enforce their intolerance. So short-term lesson is pressuring countries to move quickly to religious toleration is complicated and might backfire. In the long term, there's no doubt in my mind that in the long term, religious toleration does breed more societal harmony and less violence. Thanks.
Great, thank you, John. Lots of pearls there. Let me just identify a couple before we go to Tamara, and then we can hopefully come back to these. The historical stuff you do to me is just fascinating, and I hope we'll have an opportunity to develop that over the next few years in the Religious Freedom Project. Your point at the end about state building, the importance of the state, sort of possibly a counter argument that you did not mention is the Tudor-Stuart period under Henry VIII, where one interpretation is that precisely because of the growth of the Tudor state under Henry, you were able to literally change England from a Catholic nation to a Protestant nation with a minimum of resistance. And of course, it's a big, among historians of the English Reformation, it's a big dispute over whether the Catholic Church at the time of Henry VIII was this great rotten structure just to be prepared to be knocked over, and the desire of Henry for Anne Boleyn was just an accident. But the other is, Eamon Duffy, for example, argues that the church was in vitally healthy shape in England, and it took this mighty Tudor architecture, the new Tudor state, to actually change it from Protestant Catholic. So this is a great example of what you're talking about, and whether the Catholic rebellion was almost non-existent. You had the Pilgrimage of Grace and a few things, but by and large, you start the 16th century with a Catholic nation, and you end under Queen Elizabeth with a Protestant nation. And the problems that Queen Elizabeth is having is not with the Catholics, it's with the Puritans. Right. So, and that's Will's fault. We'll get to that in just a few minutes. All right. The other thing I want to mention from your excellent presentation is these themes of exhaustion. And also of, you hinted at this, some religious minorities are just too small and weak to make trouble. They don't have any alternative. And I would argue that the Saudi example you brought up, particularly for non-Muslims in Saudi Arabia, I mean, they have no legitimacy, let alone any power to make trouble. And of course, the Saudis argue they're here by contract. They know they're giving up their religion. and therefore they're here to work, and they can pray in their rooms, but that's all we're going to allow. So the interesting thing to me about Saudi Arabia is less the role of the Christians and the other non-Muslim minorities, but the non-Sunni Muslims, the non-Wahhabi Muslims in Saudi Arabia, both Sunni and Shia, and the role that they might play in a future Saudi Arabia. And then finally, just to return to your state building as a precondition, we put it that way, but the chicken egg problem. Do you have to have a state built before you can advance religious freedom? Or do you have to advance religious freedom before you can build a state? Or, like a good American diplomat, do you say, well, we have to do both simultaneously, and then you don't do one? All right, Tamara, over to you.
Thank you. Well, I think this is a good transition from the broad to the narrow. I'm a political scientist as well, but I'm an area specialist. I work on Middle East politics, and particularly in the last 10 years or so of my career on political change in the Arab world. So I'm going to speak to today's topic with a specific focus on the Arab revolutions and Islamist groups in that context, both violent and nonviolent. But I think that the comments that I will make will speak to some of the broader questions that we're getting at in this panel about what does religious toleration mean for a state, and what are the different models by which it could be implemented? Because I think that what we're seeing in the Arab world today is actually testing and contention among different models, and the state as an arena for contention. So let me start from the simple statement that political openings, like those we've seen in a number of Arab states in the last several years, are a particularly dangerous period for both freedom of religion, but also for religiously inspired violence. And I would say Islamist violence in the Middle East, there are greater opportunities today for nonviolent expression, but there's also greater dynamism that can have the effect of provoking or generating Islamist violence. And that's because, we're looking at Arab societies that, despite a sort of mythology of homogeneity, are actually quite diverse. In sectarian terms within Islam, but also between Muslims and non-Muslims, and Arabs and non-Arabs. And so as these political openings have played out, the nature of the state and its attitude toward the broad question of pluralism in society has become a focus for argument. Now, on the one hand, you could say that the emergence of more open politics in these Arab countries should tend to support nonviolent rather than violent Islamist movements. And indeed, we see a wide spectrum of groups in these countries, some who have been committed to violence for a long time and remain so, others that have gone back and forth between violent and nonviolent strategies for political change, and some that have been nonviolent and committed to nonviolence for some time. All of them see greater opportunities in the context of a political opening, but in theory, open politics gives more opportunity to nonviolent movements and creates inducements for movements to choose to set aside violence as a tool and enter the political competition. And so this should tend to weaken the attraction of violent extremism to broader population segments, weaken the ability of violent Islamists to recruit, weaken the attraction of their arguments. On the other hand, I think we've seen, particularly in recent months, Islamist movements that have seen themselves marginalized in the more open politics that have emerged, or in Egypt in recent months, forcibly excluded from politics in a way that could threaten renewed strength for Islamist violence there. Now, it's interesting, I think, to take a moment and think about how Islamists seek to advance what they would define as freedom of religion, which is freedom to practice and manifest their version of Islam in public life. It's certainly true that Islamists, broadly speaking, tend to promote policies that restrict freedom of religion for Muslims and non-Muslims. But I would argue that in many ways the most pernicious part of their agenda from a religious freedom standpoint is something that they do thinking with the motivation of protecting freedom of practice. And that's their advancement of anti-blasphemy laws or laws against defamation of religion. So the people who advance these proposals argue that they are important to deter the provocation of violence against those who are practicing their religion, to protect religion from assault. But there's some evidence to suggest that, in fact, anti-blasphemy laws and anti-defamation laws have the opposite effect in a society with a Muslim majority and non-Muslim minorities or with sectarian divisions, because legislating against blasphemy or defamation then leads Islamist extremists to define the expression of alternative religious viewpoints as blasphemy or defamation. It can empower those extremists essentially to bully adherents of minority religions by making the extremists feel that they have the law on their side in doing so, in intimidating or even wreaking violence on members of minority religious groups. So the Islamist approach is to legislate respect for religion. That's certainly the way that they would frame it. And in that way, in their view, to legislate the freedom to practice, if not the freedom of conscience. And given this, it's not surprising that liberal groups and members of minority religious groups in these societies seek to constrain the impact of Islamists on religion's role in public life by legislating secularism. And I would argue that the models that you see in Syria and Iraq and Tunisia before the revolution and Turkey were not state-enforced toleration. It was state-enforced secularism in the public sphere. Now, with specific legislated domains in the private sphere and dealing with family law and things like that, according to religious identity. But it wasn't legislating toleration, I would argue. Why? Because it was done on a group basis, group identity and group rights, not in terms of individual belief or practice. That would be an interesting discussion to continue. But in any event, I think liberal and minority groups in Arab societies have tended to seek to legislate secularism in a sort of Newtonian mechanical reaction. And this approach, too, restricts religious freedom in certain ways and can provoke a backlash. So you end up with a sort of tit for tat between those advocating secularism and those advocating state enforcement of religious faith. And you have no positive net effect on religious freedom in that dichotomy. So how do you resolve that? In the end, I would argue that pluralism, that is a recognition as you're creating the rules for the state and the rules for the political system, that you have to allow individuals the choice, not only in religious terms, but in political or ideological terms, that the state's role is to enable the flourishing of every individual's version of the good life, right? That's the classical liberal idea. So pluralism, including religious freedom, therefore, as an essential component, has the potential, I think, to unlock this unfortunate and unconstructive confrontation, and thereby to weaken violent extremism, even though in the short term, as we've seen, these political openings can provoke or create opportunities for greater violence. And that's because inculcating pluralism as a shared value in political systems can enable more incorporation of Islamist parties that are willing to embrace pluralism as a value. It enables, in fact, it requires the preservation of state neutrality with respect to religion, and forbids the exclusion per se of political movements rooted in religious identity. And I would argue that successful incorporation of Islamist parties into pluralist politics is the best tool we have available at the present moment for weakening violent Islamism in the Middle East. There's at least one large N study that came out before the Arab awakenings that suggests that while it's not true for political freedoms for political rights overall, that improvements in civil liberties can have at least a weak retarding effect on Islamist terrorism. I find that very interesting. I hope there's more scholarship on this. Now, the challenge is, I think, to persuade anxious secular movements and religious minorities that state neutrality rather than enforced secularism is the best path to the open society and freedom that they seek. And I think the challenge is really how you create a framework in which those beleaguered groups can feel secure in embracing state neutrality as a principle. And as Tom knows well, Al Stepan has laid out this framework of what he calls the twin tolerations, whereby there's a toleration by the state of religious actors in public and political life. The state is neutral toward those actors, as we've been discussing. But the other side of that is that those religious actors in politics are neutral with respect to state claims of authority, that they refrain from asserting religious authority as a claim over the political decision-making authorities established by the rules of the game in the Constitution or what have you. And so it's the dual toleration of the state, by the state of religious groups and by religious groups of the state's authority to make decisions for society in the political realm that allows the resolution of what is right now in many Arab countries a real standoff, I think, between legislated secularism and legislated Islam. So I'll stop with that.
Terrific. Thank you, Tamra. I wish we could get you back in the State Department, but I know you've got a good job now. Terrific themes that we want to come back to: these anti-blasphemy laws, the impact not only on minorities but on Muslims themselves as almost a prior restraint, to use an American term. You can't speak out about your views of Islam, particularly if they are what we would call liberal views or moderate. I don't particularly like that phrase, but that from the Quran, the Hadith, that it supports, for example, the equality of men and women. I mean, this is a blasphemous statement for some, and if the extremists dominate the discourse, supported by anti-blasphemy laws or practices, you have the laws in places like Pakistan. I think you have the practices in places like Egypt, although not necessarily the statutes to support them. It really doesn't matter. It's prior restraint. So that is a very important theme I want to come back to. I also like very much your discussion of the distinction between state-enforced, if you like, theocracy, state-enforced a particular religion, and the reaction of a state-enforced secularism. And using Al Stepan's twin tolerations, which, as you suggested, we use a lot here in the Religious Freedom Project, as a way of cutting through this and understanding how to convince a group like Egypt, or a country like Egypt, that this is the way through the problem that you have. So, let's send Al Stepan to Egypt. Actually, we have.
Send it back.
Send him back. Yeah, they're not listening carefully enough. Now, whether or not the state neutrality that you prescribe is the right way to approach the Egyptians, we'll talk about, and the individual emphasis in pluralism as you talk about it as the way out of this morass, we'll come back to that. Okay, we're going to turn now to Will Enboden. I should have mentioned one other thing about Will. And that is that this guy has some experience that in this field is, I think, it's very unusual, maybe unique. He worked on the Hill in both houses, for both political parties, Then he came to the State Department's Office of International Religious Freedom, where he and I worked together. Then he went to the State Department's Policy Planning Bureau, which is a think tank for the Secretary of State. Then he went to the National Security Council, where he became a senior director for strategic planning. So when it comes to policy, this guy knows what he's talking about, so let's listen to him.
Thanks. Well, what Tom's really saying there is I have a hard time keeping a job, but anyway, thanks. So John Owen, I see I'm the token historian here with 3 political scientists on the panel, although Tom, our chair, is a fellow historian too. And John Owen referred to himself as the kind of political scientist who drives historians crazy because you're dabbling in our sandbox. Well, I'm the kind of historian who drives political scientists crazy because I'm going to try to suggest a few causal pathways without using a single regression analysis. So anyway, but more seriously, I do worry about my fellow historians being reluctant to take on some of the larger big questions of causality and even the big questions with policy implications. And so I say, my fellow political scientists, you're welcome to play on our sandbox anytime. I think it helps all of us. So Tom mentioned the book I'm working on some thematic looks at the connection between religious freedom or its converse, religious intolerance and national security threats. And the big themes in the book are looking at the 3 great anti-liberal, authoritarian, totalitarian, if you will, ideologies of the last 100 years: fascism, communism, and then jihadism. And I'm going to focus most of my remarks today on the latter, on jihadism, because that's the most current concern. And I've been giving talks on this topic for a while now, for a number of years, and I frequently start with an anecdote that I thought illustrates a lot of these themes. I think I've probably shared this anecdote from this very same stage here before, which is this. If we think back to the pre-9/11 days, the late 1990s and then 2000, 2001, pre-9/11, hardly anybody was paying attention to what was going on in Afghanistan. And the only 2 communities in the West who were at all concerned about Afghanistan under the Taliban were women's rights advocates and religious freedom advocates. And the religious freedom advocates focused in particular on the Taliban's campaign of religious persecution and religious intolerance. Some of the more visible cases were the arrests of American missionaries, the destruction of the Buddhist statues, and then especially their campaign against any Afghan Muslims who did not share their fairly extreme version of Islam. And then, of course, with September 11th, everything changes. Afghanistan's now put front and center on the American strategic map as a source of a very significant national security threat, really one of the gravest our nation had ever faced. And so I'd often start with an anecdote to illustrate how the religious freedom community and the counterterrorism community and the national security community need to pay attention to each other more, and that some of these what were previously dismissed as merely humanitarian or idealistic concerns of religious freedom advocates, saying, look how terrible it is what the Taliban's doing to these Buddhist statues, in hindsight should have been seen as perhaps an early warning indicator of a more severe threat. So yeah, you can take the anecdote for what it is. Like I said, I've shared it many times in writing and in talks, but you always have to wonder, is that just a one-off thing? And I think more recently we're starting to see other illustrations of this, that there may be something to this. So in 2012, when Mali fell into all sorts of chaos, really from 2 ends. One, when a military coup toppled the previously democratically elected government in Bamako, and so the southern half of Mali was taken over there. Then meanwhile, Islamist groups took over the northern half of Mali, and it really started to fracture as a state. But there's a question, what does this mean? How bad is this? Certainly no one wants to see this happen, but is this just one other isolated case of fragile and failed states and poor government and political instability in Africa, where there's been plenty of those examples, or is this something more going on? So I wrote a short piece for Foreign Policy, foreignpolicy.com's website in the summer of 2012, just speculating on this. I wasn't sure what was going to happen. I said something that worried me was I saw that the Islamist groups in northern Mali had started kind of a Taliban-esque campaign of wiping out traditional Islamic burial sites, destroying traditional Islamic icons, because this was much more of a rigid, austere version of Islam that they were trying to impose, and they saw these things as superstitious relics. You might have seen some of the headlines about the ravaging of historic Timbuktu. And I wrote, I said, I worry, I don't know, but I worry that this could be an early warning indicator of these Islamist groups and their campaign of religious intolerance towards their fellow Muslims at the time could be a harbinger of a security threat as well. And a few months later, France, of course, has to intervene, and they would still have French troops in Mali. And then those Islamist groups in northern Mali launched a terror campaign. They take over all the hostages at the gas field facility in Algeria, ends up causing 40 hostage deaths, this major standoff. And so in hindsight, I do think there was something. I was not prophetic. I didn't predict this. I didn't know when it was gonna happen. But I do think that that the religious freedom community and the national security community, the counterterrorism community, do need to start talking to each other more, because oftentimes these campaigns of religious intolerance, especially by these Islamist groups, can be leading indicators of what will soon turn into a security threat. So what might some of the causal pathways here be? And my colleagues on the panel have already sketched out some, so I'll be echoing some of their comments and putting perhaps a slightly different gloss on some of it. I really think there's two categories of state. One are states where there is a fairly strong state with state-sponsored religious intolerance of some sort. So Saudi Arabia and Iran would be major ones here. Saudi Arabia has been getting a better handle on their problem of radicalization, but again, it's no coincidence that 15 of the 19 September 11th hijackers were Saudis. They'd been raised on a diet of religious intolerance. Of course, Iran's state sponsorship of terrorism is very well known. But then there's also the poorly governed and fragile states such as Libya now, Mali, Yemen, Somalia, where there's poor, weak, sometimes no governance whatsoever, and these ungoverned spaces, they can be vacuums where radical extremist groups can come in and fill it. This was the case with Afghanistan in the 1990s as well. And then you've got ones that might be in between, such as say Pakistan, where there is state-sponsored religious intolerance. Most notoriously, the blasphemy laws there used to, especially to target Ahmadi minority Muslims and then Christians in Pakistan, but also significant swaths of Pakistan that are poorly governed, if governed at all. So the two categories, again, the state-sponsored religious intolerance, it implicitly and often explicitly defines religious minorities as the other, outside of the boundaries of the moral and political community, and then says they're deserving of coercive measures and sometimes even violence. And then, conversely, the poorly governed spaces, absent a competent governing authority, create political vacuums that extremist groups can fill and then impose their own vision of violent religious intolerance. So as panelists, we are also asked to take up the more positive question, if you will, of does the presence of robust religious freedom hinder terrorism and other forms of religion-related violent conflict? And John and actually all three panelists took this up. I thought I had some very helpful comments there as well. I would give this a qualified yes, and I only say qualified because as someone who's happy to call myself a religious freedom advocate, we also want to be careful not to overstate the salubrious benefits of religious freedom for national security. And here I just point to some of the homegrown radicalization cases we've seen, especially in the UK and the US. The UK and the US do have very robust protections for religious freedom and cultures of pluralism, and yet that has not made us completely immune from homegrown radicalization, whether it's the major Hassan Nadal case at Fort Hood, just north of where I am in Austin now. Anwar al-Awlaki, who originally was based in the United States, then later went to Yemen, so he in some ways illustrates both of these categories. Some of the Somali American militants in Minnesota who've now been providing some support and some very troubling connections with al-Shabaab. The 7/7 bombers in the United Kingdom, et cetera. So there are examples of radicalization, security threats emanating from free societies. So we don't want to take this too far. But overall, on balance, and in contrast with officially religiously intolerant nations, I do think that countries that respect religious freedom contain institutional buffers that at least limit and oftentimes outright prevent the growth of terrorism and extremism. I think there's a few elements of religious freedom that are positive in this respect. First, religious freedom provides legal protection and political space for religious voices to dissent and to criticize the religiously violent visions of their co-religionists. And Tamara was especially eloquent on this. You know, the most effective voices against Islamist militancy are other Muslims who will say, no, this is not our religion, this is not the authentic teachings of Islam. Well, they need to have political protection, religious space to advance those arguments, to persuade their co-religious, persuade the next generation of young Muslims on what Islam really teaches and the vision of Islam that should be ascendant. Second, religious freedom protections inherently prevent the coercive power of the state from being co-opted by religious extremists and providing state resources for advancing religious intolerance and religious violence. And then third, this is where maybe the more pedagogical function of the law comes in. Religious freedom protections can help create a culture of religious pluralism and tolerance. This takes place over time, but when, you know, the way the human mind, the way society works is when the state provides certain endorsement to one way of living and restrictions on another, that can have a teaching function and can help encourage positive cultural changes, just as in turn, over time, it's going to take a culture that embraces religious tolerance to help reinforce those constitutional protections. So there's a real interplay there. And then finally, on the question of what should the United States do, we were also asked to take up some policy questions here. Well, again, focusing on the Muslim majority countries right now and the question of Islam, I'd highlight a few things. First, the U.S. should consistently support religious freedom in all Muslim majority countries. Sometimes this might mean engaging with peaceful Islamist groups, and I think we need to draw a clear distinction between peaceful and non-peaceful. Other times it might mean supporting Christian minorities and secular-minded Muslims. It's not about picking and choosing particular groups to support, but rather it's about consistently promoting policies of religious freedom. And when I say engaging with, sometimes this can mean more active dialogue with some groups than others. Second, though, the U.S. should pay much more attention to the political theology espoused by different religious parties, and thus be able to assess whether or not those parties meet a religious freedom benchmark necessary to legitimate their inclusion in the political process. And again, this is where I think one of the mistakes our government recently made in perhaps giving too much support earlier on to the Morsi government, the Muslim Brotherhood-dominated government in Egypt, was not paying enough attention to some of the real illiberal elements in the Muslim Brotherhood's theology. And then finally, the U.S. really needs to make, and I've been banging on this drum for a long time, religious freedom a priority rather than an afterthought in its counter-radicalization strategy. I think our government is still deficient, but has made some positive strides in the war of ideas, if you will, in counter-radicalization measures. But religious freedom needs to be front and center, and really one of the main elements of that.
Well, thank you very much. I want to make a couple of comments, and I'll ask a question here, but I want to get quickly to the audience. So if we have our microphones ready, as I see we do, get your questions ready and we'll come to you. But just a comment, Will, I agree with you, your codicil, if we could put it that way, on how religious freedom is not always associated with the dampening down of radicalism. And you gave the United States and the United Kingdom as an example. And I think this is something we do need to grapple with. If we have religious freedom in the United States, which we do, why these outcroppings of radicalism? However, the United Kingdom, I think, is a little bit more complicated than you suggest. And if you take a look at Brian's work on the United Kingdom, the statistics, just the facts, ma'am, you will see that social hostility to religion is skyrocketing in the United Kingdom. Much of it, not all of it, directed at Islam. So I think that's, a complicating factor, and whether or not that accounts for more radicalization in Western Europe writ large than in the United States, I think is an interesting question. I really don't know the answer to that. All right, what I'd like to do is now kind of focus on the last part of your presentation. And by the way, I want you to go back to the State Department too. The two of you, please. It would solve a number of our problems, I think. The Muslim Brotherhood, let's try to get concrete here and ask ourselves, Egypt, you know, it's an interesting case because we didn't trick them into throwing out Mubarak, I don't think, nor did we pay them, although we did give them $60–70 billion. But it doesn't seem to have contributed enormously to what happened a year and a half ago, whenever it was, in Tahrir Square. We've gone through this period of free and fair elections, the election of the Muslim Brotherhood in free and fair elections, as far as I know. And then a year of that, and the Egyptians said, nope, we don't want this anymore. Now, you mentioned the failure, I think, of the Obama administration to understand the political theology of the Muslim Brotherhood. So I'd like to just get all of our panelists to just very briefly, and then we'll turn to our audience, talk about, what is it, how could we, if we really could set back the clock a little bit, have dealt better with this issue of the Muslim Brotherhood? Understanding their political theology a little better. Tamara, you suggested in your comments that the repression of the Muslim Brotherhood now is a big mistake. And for reasons that you elaborated in the way you presented this. I mean, just the repression of these people is going to lead to more radicalization. So if you had the luxury of having been in the State Department, which you did, by the way, a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago, what might we have done differently? Let's start with Will, and we'll come back. And if you could comment on how we could get, you've all, in one way or another, or at least you two have said, we don't take this very seriously as a matter of foreign policy. If you have any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear that too. So Will, briefly, and we'll come back through here, and if Joe Friday has anything to say, we'll ask him too.
Well, first, a clarification. This is even a partial, although a very partial, defense of the State Department. The conspiracists out there want to accuse, some of the conspiracists on the right want to confuse the State Department of being in bed with the Islamists and trying to promote this. That's not the case at all. Rather, the State Department is fundamentally a status quo institution, and the State Department is hardwired, soft-wired, baked in, hard-boiled, I know, to deal with whoever is in power and to essentially embrace whoever is in power, no matter where they're coming from. This is why the State Department, I think, was too close and too supportive of the Mubarak government for too long. I'd say that I was at the State Department during the years when Mubarak was ruling, and as a former Bush administration employee, worried that we were too supportive of Mubarak and his brutal rule, and maybe not doing enough to pay attention to the opposition, especially the Muslim Brotherhood. But then in turn, once the Muslim Brotherhood comes in power, again, the State Department was too uncritical in embracing them because they were the status quo, because they were the ruling entity. So, but in both cases, I think what has been one of the State Department's besetting weaknesses has been seen itself as only engaging on a government-to-government level with whoever happens to be ruling at the time, and not having a much broader engagement with the entire society, especially with the dissident groups. So when Mubarak was in power, state didn't do enough and there were some exceptions I can share to this. But overall, if we look at the last 3 decades of American foreign policy, state didn't do enough to support and encourage, the liberal secular opposition, the democratic opposition to Mubarak. Christians were actually, pretty severely mistreated under Mubarak as well. Horrible, particularly anyone who converted from Islam to Christianity. So even though Mubarak himself was not an Islamist, he was not a proponent of religious freedom. Arguably, on measure, he was slightly better for Christians in Egypt than the Morsi government. Was, but it was a bad and a lesser
now,
case.
Will, missing from that list of people we should have engaged with is the Muslim Brotherhood. Is it your view that we should have discerned long ago that radicalism was the prime motif of this organization and stayed away from them and isolated them, or should we have attempted to influence them?
Yeah, no, this is, I do think that before the Muslim Brotherhood came to power, again for the last couple of decades, the State Department should have had at least a more vigorous back channels with the Muslim Brotherhood. And not all Muslim Brotherhoods are created equal. Some of them were much more violent and tolerant. Others of them potentially were more peaceful and at least had some potentially liberalizing elements within them. Yeah, but I also won't sit here and say if only we would have had a more robust engagement with the Muslim Brotherhood, we would have turned them all into peaceful pluralists and Democrats. So, and look, I'll also say this. I mean, policy making is really, really hard. It's not about there's a good choice and a bad choice. Rather, there's a series of 3 really bad choices, and you have to pick the least bad one. So, anyway.
Well said.
Thanks.
Tamara.
Okay, briefly, let me start by saying I think Will is very correct to point to the sort of status quo bias, not just of the State Department, but of the US government in general. If we can get our business done by dealing with whomever is in power, that's what we tend to do. And certainly it was clear, even before the revolution in Egypt, that if open politics emerged there, the Muslim Brotherhood would be the primary beneficiary. They had the organizational network, they had the party discipline, if you will, that none of the other opposition parties had. And that's partly because the Mubarak regime did such a good job of splitting and disrupting and weakening secular and liberal parties in Egypt and leaving the Brotherhood the field, if you will. Let me make a couple other points quickly, though. Number one, I think a second mistake, if you will, was an overcorrection. That the notion should be that you treat all parties on a level playing field, you, the US government, that you say, okay, whatever your ideology is, if it's religiously informed or not, there's a set of basic criteria if you want to be a constructive part of democratic politics, and we'll deal with all of you on an equal basis in that regard. And so after the revolution, when it was time to start engaging with those parties, I think because of what Will was saying, there was a tendency to devote more attention to the Brotherhood as the heir apparent, and thereby it wasn't a level playing field in terms of US engagement, and that was felt by the parties on the ground. But once the Brotherhood came to power, I actually think there was an analytical difficulty, not only for people in the US government, but outside as well. We had a lot of arguments about this in the think tank community. Was the Brotherhood acting in power in anti-democratic ways because of its religious ideology? Or was it acting in those ways because it was a newly victorious party in an unconsolidated democracy? And gosh, we've seen a lot of other newly victorious parties in first elections behave exactly the same way. And if you look at the legislative priorities of the Brotherhood when they got their majority in Parliament and got Morsi in office, it was an NGO law to constrain civil society freedom, a law to restrict political protests, and a law to eviscerate the judiciary that they saw as their enemy. Well, you could anticipate those from any party that won an election and wanted to make sure they would never lose. So was that religious ideology or not? I think there was analytical confusion there. But I would say, too, that I think the United States could have saved itself a lot of pain had it simply stuck to the principles that our government, in fact, articulated early on for what we thought was important from religious parties or other parties entering office in these transitional environments in the Arab world. And Secretary Clinton laid out those criteria very clearly in a speech she gave at the National Democratic Institute in November 2011, but they were articulated both before and after that numerous times by US government officials. The problem is that when the Morsi government began to violate those principles, the US government didn't call them on it. And so I think it was the failure to be consistent in applying the policy and to pay attention to those warning signs, which, to answer your question, Tom, if we were paying more attention to these issues, yes, we would have seen those warning signs of anti-democratic behavior earlier.
Great. John, would you like to comment on this?
Egypt in the 16th century? No.
Yes.
Well, three things. First of all, it's moments like this when I'm glad I'm just a professor, and Tom wouldn't even as a joke suggest me for the State Department. But second, on the enforced secularism versus toleration, I take the point. For the record, I will not plump for the Mubarak or Assad regimes in any sense. I still think there is, in a very general sense, a real difference, certainly if you're a Christian on the ground in one of these countries, between a regime that at least allows your community, maybe apostasy laws and blasphemy laws and so on, but allows your community to worship, has done so for years, looking forward, and this uncertainty, the possibility of Saudi Arabia or the Taliban, right? So there's a horrible dilemma that religious minorities are facing. I defer to you folks on the particulars, but I was just trying to make the point that what Assad, Mubarak et al., Saddam Hussein had in their countries was a bit like early modern European tolerance. It's not the toleration we want or hope for other people, but it's different still from this kind of, you will convert or leave or that sort of thing. And the third point just has to do with, what I take to be the difficulty in dealing with the Muslim Brotherhood, with the Morsi administration. The United States is thinking about lots of things: the peace treaty with Israel, cooperation on terrorism. Alienating the Morsi government is a very risky proposition. So I think, it's good to look at all the chessboards before we condemn. The second thing is well, this just struck me as an observer, not a participant, is a really hard problem. What are the options facing the Obama administration with the Morsi government? The election results, I think, stunned a lot of people, the early parliamentary and then the presidential elections, right? It was supposed to be a moment, kind of an 1848 for Egypt, where what we think of as the good guys would win the elections. Don't good guys win free elections? Well, it's complicated, right? So the strength, the electoral strength of the Brotherhood on the ground was, and to say nothing of the Salafists, who came out of nowhere for some analysts, was much greater than anticipated in Western capitals. So I have some sympathy for the dilemmas.
Terrific comments, John. You are now on my list for ambassador at large.
Great. I retract it all then.
All right. Brian.
One of the things that we look at in our research is whether or not governments ban particular religious groups around the world, and that occurs in a large number of countries, and they can do it for security reasons or for non-security reasons, such as they disagree with the theology of a group, such as in Pakistan, Ahmadiyas can't call themselves Muslims. It's partly security, but it's really a theological issue going on. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood was banned, then unbanned, and now they're banned again, or moving towards being banned. And they have religious elements. They perform essential social services for many people in the country. And they do have a religious dimension to it. So in the discussion of whether or not the U.S. should engage with them or not engage with them, I guess I look at it from a different point of view, seeing the religious side of it, and then that side is being banned along with the other. So it's very difficult for governments to disentangle religious groups that also have political agendas. And so sometimes when they're banning one thing, they ban other things. So even what's going on in Xinjiang in Western China today, the government is trying to deal with a security threat, but at the same time they're trying to control the religious elements, and then you get these tangled webs of what are we actually controlling? The religion, the radicals, the extremists, and that's tough work for governments who are used to not really theologians, and it's very difficult to sort through.
Terrific. Well, I'm alarmed that we've managed to create sympathy for the State Department, which has never been one of my goals.
It'll fade.
Could we now go to our audience? Wait for the mic. This lady right here and the gentleman behind her next.
Thank you very much.
If you would identify yourself and then ask a question.
That's a very enlightening conversation. My name is Nüket Sandal, and I'm from Ohio University. So one thing I want to ask our panelists, I'm not going back to 16th century Egypt, but I will go back to 1950s, 60s US abroad interventions. So when we are talking about Iran, engaging Iran and the groups in the Middle East, how do we get over the legacy of, for example, CIA toppling a democratically elected leader in 1950s Iran? Because we don't talk about this a lot in the US, but when you talk to people in the region, this is still a huge trauma. And they also talk about Latin America, Guatemala, 1970s. So I was wondering, in practice, how do we address this elephant in the room when we are engaging or supporting some groups in Iran or in the Arab world? Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for that question. Would anybody like to take this? I'd like to deal with that one quickly.
Well, I mean,
Tamara.
as somebody who spent a lot of time working on U.S. democracy promotion and democracy policy, I think the United States has always had this as an element of its foreign policy, and it's always had a degree of inconsistency in its application, partly for the reason that Will spoke to in our last go-round, the tendency of the United States to want to deal with whomever is in power, but also when they find somebody in power whom they see as fundamentally opposed to their interests, that creates a barrier to engagement that is very difficult to overcome. Now, I also think that there's a global context for that earlier history, which is the Cold War context, which is hard to ignore. And so I think you have to factor that in as you contemplate the American role in the world on this issue today as opposed to in previous years. There was sort of this overriding imperative in American foreign policy that I think is different now. But the third thing I would say is, I think we've found over time that those histories they are not an absolute bar to constructive, collaborative American engagement with governments in these regions in the wake of that history. And Latin America is a really good example of that. It's not that history is erased or forgotten among the populations or at the governmental level, but it is not a bar. Governments are there to do business for their people, and Latin America has undergone an incredible democratic transformation. You can say, you can talk about what role, positive or negative, the United States may have played in that transformation at different periods of time, but there's no question that the consolidation of democratic governments across the majority of Latin American countries has improved the United States' cooperation with other countries in its hemisphere. I think it's been a very positive development.
I would add to that religious freedom has played a role in the consolidation of Latin American democracies, and it's very important. Anybody else want to comment on this? Okay. This gentleman here, and then we'll take this gentleman as perhaps our last question.
Ian Linden, Tony
okay.
Blair, Faith Foundation. I'd just like to make 2 points and get your reaction to them. It's not exactly a question. It seems to me that the blanket use of the term Islamist is what I think one famous American professor called a thought stopper. It stops serious analysis, both diachronically of, for example, the evolution of the Muslim Brotherhood from Hassan al-Banna up to the present, and a lack of any sophisticated understanding of the dynamics within the Brotherhood, and indeed the impact of the military oligarchy in Egypt on those dynamics, is almost bound to create failures in foreign policy. And if the word Islamist is used from everything from the Gulen movement, the AKP, Erdogan, Al-Ghanouchi, all the way through Al-Qaeda, we're obviously in a ridiculous situation with a totally debased currency for analysis. Ditto for the blanket use of the word Muslim Brotherhood, which is clearly different in its manifestation, even geographically, let alone with a huge movement as in Egypt internally. Secondly, in Professor Inbonen's presentation, he I think understandably was looking at the historical manifestation of the Taliban, but it's very difficult to see in what sense the Taliban, prior to the massive influx of Mujahideen against the Soviets, could possibly conceived of as a threat against the United States of America. You haven't mentioned Nigeria either, presumably because the very, very serious Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda influenced insurgency in Kano and in the northeast could also not be conceived of as a threat against the United States of America, for a simple reason that the vast majority of these movements are directed against national governments, and it's the mutation from a national takfiri rejection of an Islamic government to a global attack on the great Satan, as it were, that is the key factor in creating national security threats. I better stop there.
Okay, anybody like to comment on that?
I'll take it up briefly. I mean, first on terminology, and this is why I love being a professor now, because those of you in the room who are not professors, we love to endlessly split hairs on terms, and we can sort of give you every last exception to something. So point taken, and we could spend another hour on that. But at the end of the day,
Fuller wrote a full book on political Islam and how do you deal with that.
Yeah. And so, and we could say the same for communism and socialism and Democrats and this and that. But at the end of the day, terms do have meaning. I think in the case of Islamism, that there's, or Islamists, that there's more in common that different individuals and groups under that umbrella have than those outside of it. So I think it's a useful, if imperfect, shorthand. Then on the national security threat question, again, to be clear, I'm not saying that anytime, anywhere that there's an Islamist, and I'm using that term, takeover and religious intolerance, that automatically it's going to then lead to a security threat against the United States, because other intervening variables will come in. What I am saying is that more often than not, a security threat may emerge, and it should be at least an early warning indicator that if those conditions are taking place, that we need to keep an eye on it because other factors may be coming in. Although I'm also an absolutist when it comes to religious freedom. I think we should promote religious freedom whether or not there's a security threat out there. So this doesn't mean that we only try to promote it where there might possibly be a security threat. I think it's a fundamental human right, and we should promote it even when there is not a core material national interest in doing so.
Love those absolutists on religious freedom. Yeah. Brian?
So, Ian, on your second point, you were talking about Boko Haram. In one of our reports, we looked at cross-national restrictions and hostilities involving religion, and we've been seeing a growing cooperation between Boko Haram and other groups around the world, including Hamas. These kinds of connections do have broader implications, and we see the majority of the world's countries having hostilities or restrictions crossing from one country to another.
Very good. I'm afraid we're just about out of time, so we're going to take one last question, and then we're going to take a brief break and get to the next group. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Christy Green from the Center for the Study of Law and Religion. And my question crosses some of the things that everyone on the panel has said about some of the unintended consequences of toleration and secularism, perhaps. This question about early warning indicators, but it's really motivated by one statistic in the Pew's report on tolerance and tension in Africa that Dr. Grimm and his colleagues put together on religious conversion, and that there was little religious conversion going on. When I read this, it was 2 years after I'd convened a conference in Africa where everyone was expressing pronounced concern about this possibility of conversion that was not going on. So what I've started to focus on is whether there's a gap between perceptions and reality on the ground. And I've read some of this terror management theory and wondered if we need to pay attention to some of these perceptual things as hard to measure as those are, and perhaps even to address those through things like public diplomacy.
All right. Well, if the State Department doesn't have enough problems, can it? I mean, perception is reality in some cases. Any thoughts, comments?
Well, I would say that in our study we found a very close correlation between how people perceive the situation to be in terms of religious threats and the threats and hostilities we're measuring. So we see people disconnect between the perceived level of religious freedom in a country and the instances of religious freedom, but the threat and then the actual hostilities, we do see a connection in the data.
Christy, sounds like you and Brian need to get together and talk about that. Tamara, last word?
Well, no, I was just going to add anecdotal data to Brian's aggregate data, which is, in Syria, you saw a raft of stories about the Shia pilgrims from Iran working to convert Sunni Syrians to Shia Islam. And that wave of stories predated the uprising and predated the sectarianization of the uprising. So it was, in a way, a leading indicator of what became a violent rift.
And indeed, one of our focuses over the next 3 years is going to be this issue of conversion, proselytization, because it feeds directly into the issues that we've been talking about. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking our panelists.